Gulliver's Travels is 300 years old this year. So does this book that's largely regarded as a classic still stand tall? Hi, I'm Amanda, and this is Spineless Books, your one-stop spoiler-free shop for all things audiobook. I picked up Gulliver's Travels for my Classics book club, and this is a book that I feel like many people read in high school, but I hadn't, so I was kind of excited to get into it. Now, one of my favorite things about reading classics is that often because the books are so old, there's a lot of options for narration. So I scanned through all of my options, and I ultimately settled on David Hyde Pierce, who you may or may not know as Niles, the brother of Dr. Frasier Crane on the sitcom Frasier. I thought he would be an excellent choice, and I figured his acting skills would probably lend themselves to the narration. But more on that later. As always, my reviews are spoiler-free, but I feel like most people know at least a little bit about the premise of this story. So I'm going to share a tiny bit from the beginning, but not much further because I don't want to spoil if you do plan on picking it up. But here's what you need to know. We meet our young protagonist Gulliver at the beginning of the book as he is struggling to make his way into adulthood somewhat prematurely. His father has 5 sons, and it's made very clear that they are extremely middle class in that his father basically tells him he can't take care of him anymore. So he sends him off to school, and Gulliver is pretty wise about how he uses the little bit of money he has, studying navigation as well as medicine. That way he knows he can be a surgeon on a ship because he knows he wants to travel. So the book doesn't tell us a whole lot about Gulliver as a person. It just says basically he wants to travel, and here he is traveling. We mostly live the story through his experiences as a narrator, as an observer of new cultures. And essentially that's what this is. It's a travelogue. The book is clearly satire, and it's very obvious that Jonathan Swift is making some commentary about Britain at the time and his opinions of how things are run and the way the culture goes. Now, in the story, Gulliver is somehow privy to all of these magical lands that nobody else seems to have access to, but he starts out at Lilliput. And Lilliput is a strange experience for him, and probably the one you're most familiar with, where Gulliver is, in comparison to the population, a giant. Most of the people average about 6 inches tall, so in comparison, his adult male form is obviously a lot larger. The Lilliputians are violent and power-hungry, and it's a good thing that Gulliver is so much bigger, because if he weren't, I'm not sure he'd be able to survive the wrath of the Lilliputians, as they fire arrows at him constantly. I mean, frankly, they're mean. And there are a few things that happen in his experience with Lilliput that make it really clear that he does not agree with the way these people live their lives. We spend a great deal of time with Gulliver in Lilliput before he decides that it's time to get out of there, and he finds his way out and returns home to England. And of course, pretty much immediately he gets the travel bug and leaves again. The lands that he travels to are each unique in their own way. For example, he travels to a land where he is significantly smaller than the rest of the population, and this is meant to highlight the grotesque nature of the human body, or at least from the perspective he observes it as a very tiny human. In another land, they value intellect so highly that common sense goes by the wayside, and Gulliver just can't abide by it. And in the final land that Gulliver visits, he finds a population that he just feels is perfect and ideal, and he would really like to spend the remainder of his days there. In fact, it alters the entirety of his perception of the human race in a way that you're just going to have to read to believe. Now, I can imagine that 300 years ago, this book was pretty controversial, but does it hold up as a modern novel? In my opinion, not really. The book amounts to 4 smaller sections that are effectively just description. There's not a whole lot of plot, and when there is a little bit of plot injected, it's so minor, and it usually has to do with Gulliver getting out of the land so we can transition to the next area. In my opinion, I think this would be more successful as short stories, but I also understand why Swift wove it together into one novel. There isn't really a lot of plot to camouflage things, so Swift's commentary on each of the areas that Gulliver visits is fairly obvious and a little bit hard to miss. I mean, you could read it as just a fantastical story, but I think it's pretty obvious he's making some statements. I'm sure this was pioneering for 1726, but given that this is a tool authors use often now, it doesn't really feel so anymore. In fact, I imagine that Swift was privy to some serious criticism, given how polarizing this book was at the time. I know it was a commercial success, but it was not without criticism. Writer William Thackeray called the book blasphemous, and members of the Whig Party were very much offended. These satirical portrayals seemed to target specific groups, but the general populace was a little bit offended by the lack of human cleanliness. So are the issues he was criticizing still relevant today? Largely, yes. I'd like to think in the last 300 years we've come a long way in human cleanliness, and that one maybe is not as relevant. But as far as power-hungry people, or those who prioritize intellectualism over pretty much everything else, like maybe human empathy, yeah, I think those are still issues we have today. Politics aside, I'm glad I read the book so that I can understand it in a more nuanced way. Did I enjoy it? No. But I now have a deeper understanding of why this book is part of the literary canon. Now back to David Hyde Pierce, the narrator. I think he did a pretty wonderful job. He really portrayed the sort of judgmental air that Gulliver has in a way where he is, new to society, so it makes sense that he's judgmental. It's not necessarily in a critical way, but he's scrutinizing everything because he's new to these lands. Now, DHP had a great run with the last section in particular, which if you know, you know. It gets a little silly in the final section, and David Hyde Pierce went for it fully. And I really appreciated that. It was actually really kind of fun to hear him let loose and be a little bit silly, especially after such a very long and tedious narration. I think he didn't really carry the book, but it's not his fault. I think it's the book's fault. I'm not sure there's any narrator that would have made this book work for me in a way that I hoped it would, but I found myself speeding up the narration as much as humanly possible. In fact, I got to a speed towards the end that I couldn't even believe I was able to understand, given that I started out at a regular speed. I just feel like the story was too meandering and tiresome in that it was all description. I love a good character story, but this wasn't even that. It was just a description story, and that to me didn't really hold up. Sorry, Jonathan Swift. Have you read this classic? Do you have a favorite portion of it? Do you think Swift could have possibly criticized everyone in a maybe different manner? I'd really love to know. Or maybe there's a classic you feel does a better job of this that still holds up today in a way that Gulliver's Travels honestly didn't for me. This book landed at a 3.5 for me. I can respect what it did 300 years ago, but today I'm not really finding that it lands. But you let me know what you think. And remember, you might love what I hate and hate what I love, so make your own opinion, and thanks for listening to mine. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. Thanks so much for your support. See you next time.